It's a great pleasure, Michael, to be having a chance to talk to you about your life and work. When were you born and where?
I was born in August 1942 in Manchester. At the age of 5, we moved, well, when I was 5, we moved to Northumberland. My father was a sales rep, a salesman for an asbestos company, and kind of lower middle class background, though he became successful and he ended up as the sales director of the asbestos company. When I was 10, we moved back to the Manchester area to Rochdale. I had in Northumberland passed the 11 plus for Newcastle Royal Grammar School, but I didn't go there. I was transferred to Manchester Grammar School, which was extremely fortunate because I had a very high class education. It was then not a public school and not a private school, but a direct grant school. So I was brought up as a teenager in Rochdale and used to commute into Manchester to school. I was the middle child, an elder sister, a younger brother. My father had eventually got a BSc at Manchester University through night school, but he hadn't received higher education before then. And my sister left school at 16, as girls generally did in this kind of environment then. My younger brother went on to university as well. I went to Oxford.
Can we hold back a moment, go back one second? So can you tell me anything about your parents? Did they influence you strongly in any way, either of them?
I think my father influenced me quite a lot. We always used to discuss and argue things, and he was a kind of liberal, and my first political experiences were as a liberal in Rochdale, in which liberalism was quite strong. My mother was a very loving, warm person who I remember her getting extremely unhappy when I told her at the age of 13 I was an atheist. But she was the core of the family. But in terms of kind of intellectual life, my father, in some ways, he was a highly intelligent man, and he did become quite successful in business. But he would also, I think, have quite liked the intellectual life as well. So there were books in the house, and my education was always greatly encouraged, and they made sacrifices in the usual middle-class way for the education of the boys.
And at school, at the Manchester Grammar School, what were the subjects that you took to and you found most exciting?
Well, I was better at the arts subjects than the science subjects, and at that school especially, you didn't take a vast range of O-level subjects, and so because it was geared very much to university entrance and especially to Oxbridge. So in fact, I never did very much science, and history was the main subject that interested me. But my father my father definitely influenced my choice of subject to do at university, and I entered Oxford to read law because he wanted to see me as a member of the professional classes, really. I did one term of law and didn't much enjoy it, and I switched to history. And I think history was...
When did you go to Oxford?
I went to Oxford in 1960 to University College.
Same year as I did.
And I enjoyed history, but at Oxford I wasn't a wonderful student. I did a lot of things. I was into politics, firstly in the Liberal Club, and then I left and joined the Labour Club. I made the move. And I played sport, and I messed around, and I didn't work terribly hard, except in the last year. And in those days, there was no examination after the first term, I think, yes, until the end of the third year. So I worked hard in my third year, and I got a second-class degree.
A good second.
A good second, though it wasn't divided then. There weren't 2 1s or 2 2s. But I wasn't terribly stimulated by the Oxford history course.
Was there anyone who stimulated you then?
I remember hearing Isaiah Berlin lecture and was very impressed by him. But no, I don't think I was terribly motivated to be a historian because I simply had not found it all that interesting. It would now be viewed as a terribly old-fashioned course, you know, English history up to, I think, 1914. I think it ended in 1914, and European history up until 1945. A couple of special subjects which I clearly enjoyed most.
What were they?
French Revolution. Maybe it was just one. It's curious that I'm now working on empires, and I was taught by David Fieldhouse, whose books I am now reading. But when I was 19, he left me cold, which was probably my fault more than his. And I had no thought of going on to do research.
So there was no supervisor or teacher who really fired your enthusiasm by the time you left Oxford?
No one at all. And indeed, when I graduated, I hadn't got a clear idea as to what I wanted to do, and I was involved already with Jill Ditchburn, who was a student of English literature who had another year to go, so I was looking to stay around in Oxford for another year. So I did the diploma in public and social administration. And we were married when I was 22. She took my name and has become quite well known as Jill Mann, who's a professor of English literature at Cambridge University, and Yale and other places on the way. A medievalist. And I was going to be a probation officer.
Really? Oh.
I got the diploma in social work, did some practical work, but in the Department of Social Administration at Oxford, Shelley Halsey, who was the head of it, A.H. Halsey, said they'd been approached by General Foods Corporation to do a study of the move of General Foods in Britain. Alfred Bird's, who was famous for Bird's custard, they were moving from Birmingham to Banbury, and they wanted someone to do a sociological study of it. And would I do it for a PhD? This came out of the blue, and I said yes. So it was a kind of accident. I had done one sociology course in my diploma, and in fact, I think that Peter Collison, who taught me, was probably the teacher who provided most for me, who stimulated me most, even though he's not a well-known sociologist, but he was a very sympathetic and interesting man. So I was quite intrigued by that, and I went and did this empirical study of this factory move.
In Banbury?
It moved to Banbury.
Yes, because there was a study of famous study of Banbury too.
That's right, Margaret Stacey, yes, it was a well-studied place. And then there was a restudy. The Margaret Stacey study was restudied by Colin Bell and others, so that, and by the end of my field work, they had arrived, and so there were sociologists there. I did a before and after interview survey of workers and managers right through the firm, 300 workers, first in Birmingham, and then in Banbury afterwards. And I had to do the first survey within the first 6 months of my PhD. And so I was thrust into the field knowing very little about anything, and drew up a questionnaire and interviewed them, and then had the problem of how I analyze it. And I had to learn about, the computerized techniques which were just moving beyond counter sorters into paper tape data. And so I had an introduction in survey techniques. So I was very much self-taught in all kinds of areas of this. and was struggling. I remember very much to keep up and to get things done. It was very hard work. And it was a mixture of industrial sociology, industrial relations, and family and community, because they were moving. The question is, why were some workers moving and others were not moving, and what was the consequences for their two sets of decisions? And I produced a dissertation, which was referred at first.
Was it? You famously referred to.
That was a very disturbing experience.
Who were your examiners?
My examiners were Jean Flood, and Jean Flood was the internal examiner, and I think Norman Dennis was the external examiner. We had the viva, they asked me to go out. I was outside for over an hour, and I could hear their voices raised at times. They called me back in and they said, "We're referring you." By this time I had moved to my first job, which was in Cambridge, which was as a research officer in the Department of Applied Economics, working with John Goldthorpe and Bob Blackburn, Robert Blackburn. And there was a first year on an abortive project, which was going to be an international project on factory social structures in 4 countries, comparing them. We got the money for the preliminary stage, but not to complete it. So that was only 1 year. And Bob Blackburn then applied for funds, which we got from the Engineering Employers Federation, to do a study of the labour market. After the abortive year, out of which I produced a little book, a book that was only 80 pages long, a little paperback, called Consciousness and Action in the Western Working Class. It was a comparison of Britain, France, the United States and Germany, but especially Britain and France. And it was playing with ideas of class consciousness and to what extent was there class consciousness, and what were differences between countries. And it was my first, in a way, playing off against Marxism. I've never been a Marxist, but I'm not unsympathetic, and I was trying to see exactly what there was in the way of class consciousness and what there wasn't, and I broke it down into different elements of iota, identity, opposition, totality, and alternative. That is, your own identity, your sense of who they were, whether this was how total an identity this was, how salient this identity was, and then any sense of an alternative society. And anyway, this is what I was doing. But then I moved on to this empirical research project on the Peterborough labour market with Bob Blackburn. And we had a team of interviewers. We interviewed 900 workers in about 6 different companies in Peterborough. And we also measured their jobs. I spent an enormous amount of time as a kind of time and motion person in a way, scoring the jobs that they did on all kinds of measures like autonomy, effort, skill level, etc. And so I was engaged in that and also rewriting my thesis. And in the meantime, John Goldthorpe moved from Cambridge to Oxford, and he took over as my supervisor in Oxford.
Who had been before? Is it Halsey?
No, I was jointly supervised by Peter Collison, the sociologist, and Alan Fox, who was a very nice man who was an industrial relations specialist. John took over really to ensure that I got my doctorate the second time round. John is a very forceful character, and he insisted that Jean Flood, who was the person who opposed my dissertation, be removed. And this is what I heard, and it went sail through the second time. And not that if that happens, you do make considerable improvements. So though I was, distraught and angry at the time, looking back on it, I think she probably did me some good in that respect. And I should also say that John Goldthorpe was quite influential in helping form some of my ideas. He was a person of very strong views, and I shared an office with him. I used his office in the Faculty of Economics, and he would use his office in King's, which is one of these staircases here. I can't remember which one in the Gibbs building. And whenever he showed up, he would be fulminating against something or other, ethnomethodology or exchange theory, which was the form of rational choice theory of those times. And in hearing him fulminate and then in arguing, discussing with him, I learned a lot about sociology, because you have to remember I didn't know very much about sociology. I was learning as I went along. It's a characteristic which continues in my career. So I got my doctorate, and I spent 4 years in Cambridge. At the same time, my political views were developing. I had been a member of the Labour Party already, never a Marxist, but in general on the left of the Labour Party. But I became convinced in that time that
this is the late 60s.
This is the late 60s,
yeah.
And the time of CND. I became convinced that the Cold War, the problem of nuclear warfare and the Cold War, didn't really have anything very much to do with capitalism, or for that matter with socialism. These were great power rivals, and these great powers were also nation states able to mobilize the sentiments of the population. And so I was developing the notion that kind of military power relations were not derivative from economic ones, which may seem obvious enough, but most of my friends on the left did not think that. And so I was developing it in a kind of pre-theoretical way, but in a related to politics. You've got to remember that in this whole period, until I left Cambridge, I wasn't really dealing with any theoretical issues or broad comparative historical issues, except a little bit in this brief encounter with comparative labour movements for Consciousness and Action, for that little book. I was actually offered an assistant lectureship here in Cambridge. And what I should say is that I got my first publication. My first publication was not actually Consciousness and Action, but an article in the American Sociological Review, which is a prestigious journal, in which I did secondary analysis of a lot of survey data in Britain and the United States about the extent to which lower class people, working class people, accepted the inequalities of society and why they did. And I developed the notion of pragmatic acceptance. It's not that people normatively believed in the inequalities of capitalism and the like, but that this was, in general, this was all that they knew, and it was normal, and there was a pragmatic acceptance of reality. And I showed differences between working class and middle class people in both countries. Now that journal article was probably the best thing that I did early on. And I remember when I was interviewed for the assistant lectureship, I received the journal that day, and I took it into the interviewing process, and they all looked at it. The committee all looked at it, and it was obvious that my claim that I'd got this in press, on my CV, was much less impressive than the real thing. And they offered me the job, but I decided I'd had enough of Oxbridge.
Was it in sociology, the Department of Sociology, or there wasn't a department, but or in economics?
No, I guess it was. No, it wasn't in economics. I think it was the first SPS. I now can't remember, but I assume it was the first SPS
But
What
SPS
is,
had four lectureships within the Department of Applied Economics. They were SPS.
oh, right, okay, the first SB, yeah, okay, right. And perhaps it was the one that was then offered to Ray Jobling. I can't remember,
Yeah.
or maybe not. But anyway, I decided I'd had enough of Oxbridge, and I went to the University of Essex. David Lockwood, who I'd of course met before, who had been in Cambridge when I first arrived, who I always respected very good, still respect very much. He persuaded me to go to Essex. So I went to Essex for some years.
As a lecturer? As
a lecturer. I was there from 1970 to 77. When I went to be interviewed at Essex, they asked what I would teach, and I said various things. They then said, would I help teach the interdisciplinary course on the Enlightenment? So I said, oh yes, of course, wondering vaguely what the Enlightenment was. And indeed I did. And I also taught classical sociological theory. I taught Marx, Weber, Durkheim, a course that I continue to do today. And I'd read the Communist Manifesto and the Protestant Ethic, but I was reading up ahead of the students, essentially, as I was in the Enlightenment, reading Rousseau and Locke and looking at the paintings of Reynolds, Gainsborough and things, and this was a very broadening experience. And Essex in those days was a very interesting experience. The students were good; they were questioning. Students at that time thought that sociology might provide the answer to the question, the meaning of life. And I had stimulating colleagues, and I began to develop as a more general sociologist. Up to now, my work had been very empirical, very located in industrial sociology, with slightly broader things coming in, but not being the core of my activity. And in 1972, I wrote for myself a paper contrasting Marx and Weber, their theories of stratification. You know, the simple version is, Marx 1, Weber 3, but at this time, it was the Althusserian period, and Althusser and especially Poulantzas were exploring the idea that Marx was 3 as well, the economic, the political, the ideological. And so I was putting these views together and trying to decide what I thought about them. I never did anything with that paper, but I continued to work on that, and the idea was to write an ordinary sized book on that kind of problem with 1 or 2 empirical historical case studies. One was the Roman Empire, one was going to be European feudalism, and one contemporary. And that gradually turned into the sources of social power.
Is it? That was the roots.
That was the roots, and that was still meant to be a single book with these case studies and perhaps 1 or 2 more as a single volume. And this was when I took it the furthest step of separating the military from the political, and I gradually crystallized that as what is military is the social organization of lethal violence, and that is killing people or threatening people, terrorizing people, and that is not the same as the institutionalized regulation of societies over given spaces, centrally by law, but with parliamentary assemblies and that kind of thing as well. And that's political, and the 2 can and should be separate. And I find over and over again this enormous neglect of lethal violence among sociologists, and I think much less among anthropologists, but certainly among the social sciences that is sociology, politics, and also to some extent history. And so I had 4 sources of social power: the IEMP, ideological, economic, military and political, in which I was unwilling to give any single one primacy, but was interested in exploring their interrelations and seeing what came out. Still rather empiricist, even though now at a broad level. Well, gradually the case studies became bigger, and I began to put in some linking historical passages, which made it seem as if it was a complete history. Then it got too big, and I separated it into 2 volumes.
What date was this now, when you decided to separate it into 2 volumes? Had you left Essex by that time?
No. I was at Essex in 70 to 77. Actually, okay, I should fill in the biographical details here. My wife, Michael Mann, was still in Cambridge, and we had a bit of a commuting life, and that put too much strain on the marriage, and we broke up in, I would say, 1983, around there, and
83.
No, it can't be. If I was
in Essex,
set to this, yes, no, it happened while we were there. It must have been, well, I don't know when, 75, something like that.
Yeah.
I should have come organised with with an autobiography.
Well, we're historians, so the details
No, but I've always said that the date list was the one thing that the one methodological tool that I acquired from history as an undergraduate. I used to prepare for exams, the final exams, by having a long date list. Compromise of Avranches, 1172, I can still remember that. Not too sure what it was any longer, what it is. So I ought to be able to remember dates, but...
So you separated in the
mid-70s? Yes, and...
Had you had children by then?
No, we didn't have any children. Which, Jill didn't really want children, and I did, though that wasn't the main issue. Yes, the sources of social power was still germinating. What I don't quite understand now is how easy I was. After my marriage broke up, I decided that I probably wanted somewhere else to live. I didn't want to live as a single person on a little campus outside of a small town. And I went to LSE in 1977. And I got a job as a readership in research methods, which was not me at all, but it was obviously I taught the graduate course in research methods along with the statistician, and that was the meal ticket for the job. But what puzzles me now is how I got that job so easily, given that my dissertation was published, my little book on class consciousness, but I hadn't really got anything to show. I had a couple of articles, one on states, ancient and modern, but I hadn't got very much to show when they appointed me as a reader at LSE. So I don't quite remember that. While I was in Colchester, I was politically active for a short time. I was on the General Management Committee of the Colchester Labour Party, and was at this time trying to restrain my leftist colleagues from breaking up the Labour Party. I was one of the unavailing few people who tried to keep the right and the left together, and the right left to become Social Democrats. And in fact, the leader who was of that group, who was a very worthy local councillor, is now the Member of Parliament for Colchester as a Liberal Democrat, Bob Russell. So I was somewhat politically active, and taking more interest in all kinds of political issues. I wrote a Fabian pamphlet around then, and was becoming quite involved in Labour politics at a national level. I moved to LSE and moved physically. I bought a house in Lambeth. I and someone else left, and our two replacements were Maxine Molyneux and Nicky Hart. And Nicky and I overlapped for one term in Essex, and we got involved, and she then became my second wife. She was then married to Keith Hart, the anthropologist, but he was at Yale. I assumed more than was in fact the case in terms of separation, but that played out as her having an affair with me, and we got married, and I acquired Louise, who was 2 years old, and we've had two other children, Gareth and Laura, and they're now in 2005, Louise is 30, Gareth is 25, and Laura is 22. And we had a very nice family life in Dedham, Essex. And we, because we lived close to where Nicky's work was at the University of Essex, and I commuted into London then. Now at LSE, the big experience for me was not really within the sociology department itself. The sociology department was not terribly happy. It had two complete jerks as the senior professors.
Who's this to go on to?
Donald McRae and Terence Morris. And now they had forced Ernest Gellner out a while before that. And they were not particularly distinguished, and they were quite intolerant of new ideas and things. The people of my age in the department were very good, and we had a fine unofficial life together, but we were never able to do for the department what we wanted to do. So we used to have a regular seminar series in each other's flats and houses in London, and these were Nikos Mouzelis, Colin Crouch, Ian Roxburgh, Anthony Smith then came, and there were others. No. Okay, that was so. The main experience was the seminar series that Ernest, John Hall, and I did. Now, John didn't have a connection at LSE, but he was brought in for some part-time teaching from Southampton, I think by Ernest, and we collectively ran this seminar, which we called Patterns of History, and Ernest was the leading person he provided the money, but we would invite anybody who was willing to generalize about history, who we wanted to hear, and we had this, and they would give a seminar, and then afterwards we would go and have a meal and talk about it a lot. And both Ernest and John were excellent. I mean, Ernest, as you know, is a great theorist, and he's also has the tremendous ability to sum up a kind of whole serious, complex argument with a witticism. And John was someone who could, or still is someone who could, when someone gives a talk, he can immediately, his first question is, so the basic argument is this, and do you see X, do you see Y as a problem for this argument, or isn't there a little bit of a contradiction between X and what you said elsewhere? Tremendous ability to grasp central ideas and then to present some sympathetic criticism and exploration of it. And so, we, among the people, we invited Colin Renfrew, who I've seen in my trip to Cambridge this time, Keith Hopkins, all kinds of people. And that was tremendously helpful. we were all, John, Ernest and I were all writing books about broad theoretical history at this time, and we were pillaging and looting these people for our use in our own books. And Ernest was tremendously stimulating, of course. So that was the best, probably the best experience I've had. Though there has been an almost comparable one at UCLA, which I'll get onto later. I was at LSE from 77 to 86, 77 to 87. In about 85, I got together with someone in the IR department, and we were going to produce...
International relations.
Yes, international relations. We're going to do a course on globalization. Or, no, 2 courses. Mine was the sociology of globalization. This was in about 85. And I was blocked by McRae and Morris. And McRae said this wasn't real sociology, etc. And it was a struggle for a couple of years, and I never got to put it on. I was also blocked for promotion in 85, or 85 to 86. And I was told that you could actually apply for a chair independently of your department. So I did this, and I got a chair. But before that, actually, before I was offered it, I was actually hired at UCLA. Now, my book, the first volume of The Sources of Social Power, came out in 86. So I suppose it was while I was at LSE, probably about 1983 or 4, maybe 1984, that I took the decision to separate it into 2 volumes at that time. And the volume that came out was volume 1 in 86, went from prehistoric societies to 1760, that is just before the Industrial Revolution. And I thought that this book, which has a general theory of society in chapter 1 and then deals with prehistoric societies, and then with over half the book is concerned with periods before you even get into medieval Europe. And I thought that this book might just sink without trace between all of these disciplines that it dealt with. It's not what sociologists do, it's not what historians do. There's a bit of anthropology, a bit of archaeology, but I thought it might sink. So I contacted everybody I knew in America and asked if I could give a talk there on it. The number of people I knew wasn't great, it was 6. So I went around and lectured to her. By the time that happened, the book was very successful. And so I needn't have done that. But Americans assumed I was looking for a job, which was an assumption you'd make about Americans. That wasn't true, but, well, the idea played on our minds. UCLA and the University of Virginia offered both Nikki and I full-time positions. We thought, well, all right, we'd rather live in Los Angeles. We'll take it for a year and then see. And we've stayed there ever since, and that's been excellent. At UCLA, I have had a comparable experience to the Ernest Gill and John Hall seminar, which is it's a center for social theory and comparative history, but that essentially consists of a seminar as well, which Bob Brenner, Perry Anderson, and I are the leading people in it, but there are other people involved as well. And again, we invite people we want to hear from all over the world. We have themes, unlike the patterns of history. We have a theme each year. Might be the state, or it might be development, or things. And we have 2 or 3 people come and give talks. There are discussants, and we all go to dinner afterwards. And again, it's the same kind of experience. Like the first one, it's interdisciplinary. And so I've always been someone who though I consider myself a sociologist with definite, sociological approach to things, I've never been happy about being trapped inside a discipline. And so these, I think, have been the most stimulating experiences. In 1990, wait a minute, I went to UCLA in 1987. In 1994, I went to Madrid for a year, and we were at that point a little unhappy in Los Angeles, but mainly for the education of our children. And I came back to Madrid to the Instituto Juan March for 1 year, and then had a little period of sabbatical in England. And we both looked for jobs in England, and Nikki actually started a job at the University of East London, chairing the department, and I was offered a job by Essex and LSE. But she was so unhappy there that we decided to move back, and I never took up either of those offers. So we've stayed at UCLA ever since. And in 1998, I took up American citizenship, partly because it's kind of easier to stay longer out of the country.
You've got dual citizenship?
I've got dual citizenship, yes. And I voted in the 2000 election. It must have been the 1999 primaries. No, early 2000 primary. I voted in the Republican primary because the Democrat was locked up by then. I voted for John McCain against George W. Bush. So this is the kind of largely autobiographical. I've been very happy in Los Angeles. We have it's a place, one of those places where one's friends who are interested in intellectual issues and artistic issues, they don't have to be academics. You're often connected in some way with the movie industry, and it's a stimulating and interesting place.
Currently, can you just say something about the book you're working on at the moment, the lectures you've just given?
Yes. Right, I should just fill in, I suppose. Yes, I should say something about my other books as well, should I? Yeah. Okay, well, having produced Volume 1 of Sources of Social Power in 1986, Volume 2 followed in 1993, but instead, as originally I planned for that to bring it up to the present day, it only took it to 1914. And because I got a bit bogged down in the enormous amount of empirical materials that are available for modern societies. So Volume 3 still remains unfinished. When I went to Spain, I decided to work first on a chapter on fascism, because there was a very good library where I was working on fascism. And that chapter on fascism turned into 2 books. The first one was called Fascists, and the second one is The Dark Side of Democracy, Explaining Ethnic Cleansing. And they were both published in, Fascists came out in late 2004, and the Ethnic Cleansing book in early 2005, and I'm kind of waiting to see what the reaction is, really. But in the meantime, in 2002, late 2002, I began to write a book on American foreign policy, on the Bush foreign policy. That became Incoherent Empire, a book that I'd largely written, almost entirely written, before the invasion of Iraq. But it, of course, given the time of publication, it came out in September 2003. It was called Incoherent Empire, and it wasn't a moral denunciation of the foreign policy. It just said that America was embarked on this new imperialism, and did America have the powers, ideological, economic, military, and political, to carry it off? And I said no. It's a detailed analysis of the powers that the US has, and then an exploration of the war on terror, Afghanistan, Iraq, weapons of mass destruction, these kinds of issues. I wrote it in 6 months, essentially, which I've never done before. and that was quite successful, less so in the United States than elsewhere. But it had the great advantage of taking me all around the world. There have been translations in many languages. When I got the invitation to be the Pitt professor in Cambridge, I wondered what I would give my lectures on, and I decided to give them on modern empires to explore more. I briefly made comparisons between the British Empire and the American Empire today, but it was a bit flimsy, and I decided I wanted to, research this more thoroughly. So I gave the 4 lectures, which are essentially, the first one is why were Europeans so imperialistic? Why did Europeans go out and conquer much of the world? The second part was, did the British Empire do anyone any good? The third one was a kind of comparison of Japan and the United States in Asia, and especially focusing on Japan. And then the fourth one on the American Empire today. There were the 4 lectures, and I'm expanding this. The main area of expansion is trying to understand American foreign policy from the beginning, and dealing a lot with 1898 and with the dollar diplomacy and Roosevelt's good neighbor policy, and then the Cold War. And so I'm kind of educating myself on that now, and it's been an ideal period in Cambridge where I've been able to get a lot of research and writing done, and that will hopefully come out towards the end of next year, 2006.
Excellent. Well, I just had a couple of quick questions. One was that you marshal in your books a huge number of facts and sources and so on. I wondered how you organize you obviously have a good library at home. Do you work in any particular way? Do you take extensive notes? Do you index your materials, or do you rely on your memory a lot?
I don't rely on my memory. That would be terrible. Things have changed with computers, with laptops, with library services. One thing I can do at UCLA is I can, through the UCLA network, I can order books, have them delivered to my office, and then I read them. So I do an enormous amount of reading, but let me put it this way, I do an enormous amount of pillaging of books, because if you have a kind of, I don't have a strong theory. This is not a theory which tells me how things are going to be, but I have a theory which is a kind of framework which tells me the kinds of things I want to know. And so I raid books for the kinds of things that I need to know. And one thing, I read an enormous amount of history books, obviously, but one thing that I'm just not interested in is orthodoxy against revisionists and that kind of thing, or books with a high theoretical overlay on, whether it's Althusserian Marxism or is after the cultural turn, it's culturalism, right? So I'm looking for factual materials, and so I can actually, I can raid, a man's reach should exceed his grasp, I suppose. Without fully digesting the books as historians would want me to, I can extract materials from them. I have taken notes, extensive notes. I have just discovered over the last few months a new technique of library raiding, which is that there are a lot of book reviews available in journals on the web. And I will go to these book reviews to see if this is the kind of book that I think I might be interested, and I'll download the details of it and some of the arguments it appears to have, and then with this I will go to the library and I'll borrow from here in Cambridge. I'll borrow the book, bring it back, and then extend this kind of half page that I've got into however many pages of notes are needed. And so now all the notes really exist on my laptop and on a memory stick. So and I had a basic methodology in my reading, which is that I would carry on reading until I was only changing the details. Very often you read something and it changes your whole view of the period, and so as long as that is happening, I will carry on reading, but I'll stop, because you can't possibly read everything there is to know on these things. And especially on something like, I'm looking at the Japanese Empire and puzzling over whether the kind of, first of all, the kind of informal empire and the gradual intensification of the controls on Korea, and then the expansion into China, whether this, what looks with hindsight to be, not inevitable, but a highly probabilistic outcome of a more and more imperialistic policy. Well, is it a series of accidents? Or, what are the factions involved in the Foreign Office and things? Now, clearly my ability to understand this is somewhat limited by the fact that I don't speak a word of Japanese and can't read any Japanese books. But insofar as I can make sense of it in terms of how these things happen, I mean, granted that empires, the British Empire as well, has a certain accidental quality about it. Can I make sense of it in terms of kind of comparative materials?
The second question was about writing. You mentioned a book you wrote in 6 months, and you've written very, very extensively. Do you have any particular advice to younger viewers or anecdotes about how you write? Do you write at a certain time of day? Do you write a certain amount? Do you handwrite? Do you type? How do you write?
I've only ever written one book in 6 months. I normally take 6 years, which the 6 months is not to be recommended. And I half killed myself doing it. I couldn't have done it without the web, because without the internet. If you're dealing with right now, you can find enormous amount of materials right now on the web. I try and begin to write at quite an early stage as a way of organizing the notes. And then I will rewrite as I read more stuff. So in the early stages of my writing, I'm trying out arguments. I wouldn't like to show them to anyone, because they would have a lot of assertions for which I have no real knowledge, just a suspicion. And then I will carry on refining them as I read more stuff and qualifying them. I don't write at any particular time of day. My wife is a morning person. She gets up early to work, and I've gradually been influenced by that towards working more early. But I used to be a 9-to-5 worker. But I think one of the kind of tragedies of the relatively successful academic is the older you get, the harder you work. So I'm no longer I work longer hours than 9-to-5 nowadays.
Do you have any hobbies that take you away from work?
Well, I still play sport. I still play tennis, and I've just taken up golf. Used to do gardening. In a way, when I was a sociologist of a very traditional kind, I used to read history books as a kind of diversion, but now that's part of my work. So I think, no, I'm not a Renaissance person. I really only do one thing for the most part.
The last question I had was, you nearly set up a global history program, and there has been one set up, as you know, by Patrick O'Brien, World History at the LSE. And we used to have seminars on world history. It's not an easy field, world history or global history. I was wondering whether there was any person or model or theory which you felt guided some of your work on broad comparative history.
Well, I think that the person that I owe most to is Max Weber, and the second person would be Karl Marx. These, of course, very classical sources. I remember being very impressed by Owen Lattimore, William McNeill, though he writes terribly, Eisenstadt. I think, kind of, but I'm, world history, yes, it's, as you say, it's not an easy thing to do, and I tend to feel that I would never recommend young people to try and start doing what I'm doing. I think in a way you have to do a detailed research project on something to get a sense of what research is, whether you're a historian or a sociologist or whatever. And really it's on the basis of this that you can perhaps begin to think about more comparative materials, generalizing and the like. But I'm still a little bit, despite the fact that I'm obviously a grand generalizer, I'm still a little kind of time and space bound, so that I also have a little problem with world history. In recent years, I think that the kind of, the anti-Orientalism, the Chinese revisionism, Pomerantz et al. Is one of the more interesting things to happen. So that's influenced me. I mean, earlier on, Ernest influenced me, and John Goldthorpe influenced me. Though I fell out with John Goldthorpe later, and he turned very much against the kind of work that I do. But I think that I'm a little bit of an individualist. I haven't done any collaborative work since that period with Bob Blackburn. I do my own thing, and I am a bit of a loner, so I'm not aware of enormous influences. I can distinguish between good books that I've read and not so good books, but I can't think of books that have actually changed fundamentally the way that I look at things.
So was there anything that we should have talked about you would like to mention? I haven't. I mean, there may be another occasion until you're
Well, we haven't talked about, the kind of my basic ideas, but that doesn't matter. I mean, that's too long. That would take too long.
And also, it doesn't work very well on.
It's
half ideas, half life. But
yes,
so,
yes. Well, I should just add that I'm after finish this book on empires, I'm still determined to write volume 3 of The Sources of Social Power, and that will bring it up to date. And I have intermittently said that there might be a volume 4, which would be a theoretical book. Whether there will be at this stage, I have no idea. But the next thing I do will be to attempt volume 3, though I know that it's going to be the most difficult thing to write, because there's so much material available on the 20th century and beyond. And also there's so many arguments still going on about what it all means.
What do you think of the other great attempted trilogy by Gary Runciman on 3 volumes, which have finally all come out? Has that influenced you at all? Or?
No, not great. No, I don't think it has. I find Gary's work always, very stimulating, very interesting, but the evolutionism is not something that I can easily accept, and that's become very dominant in it. So of course, the other competitors, as it were, they don't write their third volumes. I'm talking about Perry Anderson and Wallerstein. So maybe I will, and maybe I won't.
Well, that's a nice bit to end on. So thank you very much indeed.
Okay, thank you very much, Alan.